The Obama administration is considering a plan to increase the U.S. presence in Iraq by sending 400 to 500 more military personnel, as well as establishing a new military base in Anbar province. The United States already has about 3,000 troops, including trainers and advisors in Iraq. The administration is describing the new military personnel as advisors who will help train Iraqi forces in an attempt to retake the city of Ramadi, which fell to the self-described Islamic State last month. Plans to retake Mosul may be pushed off until next year. The move comes just days after President Obama acknowledged the U.S. does not yet have a, quote, complete strategy to deal with ISIL, which has seized large swaths of Iraq and Syria. It was a year ago this week when Islamic State fighters seized Mosul, Iraq's second largest city. Today, the city remains in ISIL's hands. Advisors close to the White House say it could take decades to defeat ISIL. At the recent U.S. Islamic World Forum in Qatar, retired Marine General John Allen said, quote, "This will be a long campaign. Defeating Daesh's ideology will likely take a generation or more," he said, using the Arabic name for ISIL.
Meanwhile, Doctors Without Borders is reporting Iraq is now facing its biggest humanitarian emergency in a generation. Almost 3 million people have fled war-torn areas of Iraq controlled by the Islamic State. The United Nations estimates 8.2 million Iraqis, nearly 25% of the population, will need some kind of humanitarian help this year. To talk more about the fight against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, we're joined by two guests. With us here in New York, Malcolm Nance, a retired Arabic-speaking U.S. counterterrorism intelligence officer and combat veteran who first worked in Iraq in 1987. He's the author of several books, including The Terrorists of Iraq, Inside the Strategy and Tactics of the Iraq Insurgency, 2003 to 2014. His new piece for The Intercept is called ISIS Forces That Now Control Ramadi Are Ex-Ba'athist Saddam Loyalists. And joining us from London is Patrick Coburn, Middle East correspondent for The Independent, just back from reporting in Iraq and Syria. His latest book, The Rise of Islamic State, ISIS, and the New Sunni Revolution. His most recent article on Iraq is headlined, War with ISIS. As the militant threat grows, so does the West's self-deception. Let's go first right here to Malcolm Nance. Welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about this latest piece you have written. Talk about the political context for the rise and the power of ISIS today.
Well, the biggest misperception now, we're here on the first anniversary of ISIS taking the city of Mosul, and the biggest misperception that the media has certainly fostered is that ISIS is this new group, which has appeared out of nowhere. They have blitzed across the Middle East, and they have managed to take large swaths of Iraq and Syria. And when in fact, ISIS is the same group and a conglomeration of groups that we've been fighting since the day we invaded Iraq in 2003. The piece that I wrote in The Intercept, which was extracted from parts of my book, based on my book, The Terrorists of Iraq, is that the former regime loyalists, almost 100,000 of them, who were all taken away from their jobs by Ambassador Bremer's General Order No. 2, went underground and have been fighting us for the last 13 years, nonstop. However, al-Qaeda in Iraq, which started in 2003 as well, has taken over the upper-level management of these groups. And so what we have is technically a mega group of all the former regime loyalist insurgent groups, all of the Iraqi Islamic insurgent groups, and the foreign fighters who have used Syria as a base camp, and they now are called ISIS.
But Malcolm Nance, how do you reconcile the fact that the Baathists were largely a secular, semi-socialist party when they started, reconciling their ideology and their approach to the world with that of jihadists?
Yeah, it's very interesting because the jihadists wouldn't even have been in Iraq until after the U.S. invasion, when the communities that were former Baathists, and you're right, the Baathists were secularists. The Ba'ath Party was this conglomeration of socialism and secular government that formed into a dictatorship under Saddam Hussein and also under Hafez al-Assad in Syria. Now, but people who were in Iraq who were Baathists were still Muslims. And as a matter of fact, Saddam Hussein, in the later years after the U.S. sanctions went into place and after the Iran-Iraq war, started to become more Islamic in name. That is, to co-opt Islam from the people on the street. The jihadists who came in just after the invasion, the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, came in with their own ideology, which is radical extremist, almost cultish Islam. But the Baathists understood that these people had the motivation and the combat capacity to do things that the Baathist forces didn't have to do. As a matter of fact, you had al-Qaeda in Iraq would carry out all the suicide bombings that they wanted. The Baathists would facilitate their entry in from Syria, would build car bombs for them, would gather all of the intelligence against U.S. forces, direct them to it, and they would drive their car bomb into a target. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them over the 12 years that Iraq has been in this turmoil. But it's a marriage of convenience to a certain extent. Mosul was a Baathist city. Tikrit was a Baathist city. These are the people who ruled Iraq with an iron fist from 1968 to 2003, and they're the people who are actually living there. ISIS is just the spearhead of the forces that have now joined them, who are Baathists as well, but ex-Baathist. And they have now taken this patina of the Islamic, caliphate on top of that and have sworn their loyalties. But they are the 7 million person population that owns the place.
Patrick Coburn, you're the Middle East correspondent for The Independent. You're just back from Iraq and Syria. Do you share this assessment of Malcolm Nance?
No, I think that there's a big a disconnect between what's happening now and what happened when Iraq was ruled by the Ba'ath Party. Remember also the Ba'ath Party and the Iraqi security forces were supremely unsuccessful militarily in 2003, 91, and before, while Islamic State is very successful. Both come out of the Sunni community at all, but I don't think that the Islamic State is the Ba'ath Party in a new guise. I mean, one thing that does strike me, though, as very important at the moment, and I've just been in northern Iraq and northern Syria, talking to people who've come from Islamic State, is that it's recruiting people all the time. It's introduced conscription, so it's calling up tens of thousands of young men. So it's an expanding organization. And I don't think that the outside world in America or anywhere else have quite taken on board how tough this organization is and how quickly it's growing. And every so often we hear accounts that, it's got weaker and so forth, but then it takes another city. It took Mosul, it's taken Ramadi, it's taken Palmyra, and now it's getting close to Aleppo, once the biggest city in Syria, and it's threatening western Syria. So this is, people talk about, it's going to take so many decades to get rid of this organization. But the problem is much more immediate. This is an expanding organization. It's a military machine that combines religious fanaticism with military expertise, and it's growing all the time.
And Patrick Coburn, how do you account for this such a fast growth of the organization, especially given the years when there didn't seem to be any expansion of the jihadists, especially in Iraq?
Well, it looks to the Sunni community in Iraq and Syria. The Sunni are about 20%. Sunni Arabs about 20% of Iraqis, about 60% of Syrians. When the Syrian uprising took place in 2011, there was a whole big new constituency for them. And militarily, they're much better organized and more effective than the other groups in Syria. And although they've expanded, they still seem to be able to create a real state. I mean, that's one thing that struck me talking to people from there. They've introduced taxation, they've introduced conscription, they've introduced horrible laws restricting women from leaving home without a male relative, and you get beaten if you don't do that. You have to wear the niqab covering the whole face if you're a woman. And anybody who opposes them ends up dead very fast. We were talking to the leader of one tribe in Iraq, the Abu Nimr, and 864 of them have been killed since last October. So this is a savage organization, but it's a pretty effective one, and it administers everything. It controls education, even fishing rights in the Euphrates River. They have a whole series of instructions, what you can and cannot do. You can't use explosives, you can't use poison. So it really does control the area into which it's expanded, which is greater than the size of Great Britain, and maybe has at least 6 million people in it.
So your main point of disagreement with Malcolm Nance is simply that, while it may have started with different groups, it is far larger than the Ba'athis of the past?
It's far larger than Al-Qaeda was during the 10 years ago or since. It's got much bigger. The Ba'athists, if you were a Ba'athist back then, most of these people are pretty young. If you have to go back to Ba'athist Iraq, these guys, if all the militants came from there, it'd be quite an aging organization. But I don't think that's true. I think there's a connection in the leadership. Some of these people come out of the Iraqi security forces, but I think that it's developed into a very different type of organization,
well,
and unfortunately a far more effective one.
Let's get Malcolm Nance's response.
Well, in some respects, he's right. It is a very different organization. It has developed in a different way, and it does have a large quantity of young men. But let's not forget history here. If you were a member of the Saddam Fedayeen at age 20 when the United States invaded, you'd be 35 years old right now, and you would be a mid-level commander with 13 years of extraordinary combat experience under your belt. There were 100,000 Iraqis that we fought when we invaded Iraq. We only killed 6,000 of them in the invasion. That's a lot, and it's horrific that we even did it. But the very fact is that left almost 90,000 people who were there to fight us during the 8 years that we were in combat with them. Al-Qaeda in Iraq got all of the news during the time that we were fighting. The United States believed that Al-Qaeda in Iraq was everyone that we were fighting, but in fact we were fighting 30,000 Saddam Fedayeen, 26,000 intelligence agency officers and managers, 6,000 senior Ba'athist commanders who had Iran-Iraq war experience. These people are the Sunni community of Iraq. They are the men and their children who are the people who own northern and western Iraq. ISIS is just Al-Qaeda in Iraq evolved. Once in 2011, Syria fell. That gave them a complete playground, gave them all the lines of communications, weapons that they could take and use it as a sanctuary to start carving out these areas. But you can't carve out Anbar province. You can't carve out Nineveh and Tikar without actually co-opting the communities that are in there who turned against them in 2007 during the Iraq Awakening campaign. It's just in 2011 they turned back to the people who were going to give them the autonomy they weren't getting with the al-Maliki government. So, yes, it's a young organization. I know this organization. I have fought this organization. This organization has tried to kill me. I take it very personally. I see how they operate, and I understand that their tactics, their blitz tactics, are very effective against the Iraqi army that really doesn't want to be where they are. But as they take these communities like Mosul, that community of Mosul, of course, that community in Mosul are the Sunnis who have always been there and who have ruled Iraq, and they are allowing them to come in.
We're going to come back to this conversation after break. Our guests are Malcolm Nance, a retired U.S. counterterrorism intelligence officer and combat veteran. He's here with us in New York, has a piece in The Intercept. And Patrick Coburn is with us, just back from Iraq and Syria, Middle East correspondent for The Independent. He's joining us from London. Stay with us.